All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. Welcome, everybody, to our first expanded education policy brown bag talk of the 2022-2023 academic year. It's good to see all of you. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the series this year, Dr. Heidi Erickson. Heidi Holmes Erickson is an assistant professor of educational leadership at Brigham Young University. Prior to coming to BYU, she was a visiting assistant professor at Kennesaw State University. Her research focuses on school accountability, school choice, and the effects of cultural exposure for students. She has published her research in some of the leading journal outlets in education and economics, including the Journal of Human Resources, the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness, and Educational Researcher. Today, Dr. Erickson is going to present some of her new and ongoing work on the academic and social emotional effects of field trips. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to you, Heidi.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. And thanks, everyone, for having me. It's always a great opportunity to present work and hopefully get some good feedback and thoughts. So also, please feel free. This is really casual to me. One, I should apologize. We're getting over a cold here, so my voice might sound a bit funny, but also, please feel free to interrupt. I don't mind questions throughout. I'm used to working with economists who always interrupt, so I have no problem with questions throughout. If I might not see your hand, I might see your hand, but if not, just unmute your microphone and shout out, and then also try and save some time at the end for hopefully a better discussion. So today I'm going to present some work with some colleagues of mine, both Angela Watson at Johns Hopkins University and Jay Green, on an evaluation we've been doing on culturally enriching field trips. And thought I'd start with giving you a little bit of a motivation behind why I'm interested in this topic and why I study it. And I'm going to present results from one specific study that we're working on, but I want to talk more broadly also about why this is interesting. And then at the end, talk about some ongoing work that I have in this field. So one is just this motivation to understand extracurriculars. And there's a large body of literature on extracurriculars in education. We generally think of these things of outside school time, right? Whether it's connected to school or not, but these extracurriculars build student social and cultural capital, expand their networks in a variety of ways. And field trips could be seen as a type of extracurricular activity, right? They don't fit into the normal content of a traditional school day, but it's a long-standing tradition in school. You guys can probably all think back to times at school that you went on field trips, right? You could probably think of places you went or looked forward to, or your kids go to field trips or anything like that. But despite it being a really popular tradition and teachers talking about it a lot, there's really little research evidence on the value of field trips, right? How does it impact students both academically and socially? So along with that, over the past 30 years or so, there's evidence of kind of a cultural field trip. The number of field trip students take is declining. So there's a couple reports that both look at institutions who support field trips. So students come to them and they report that fewer student groups are coming to them. They also report an increase in schools canceling field trips throughout the year. And then a survey of principals and teachers when asked about how many field trips they go on and why they might choose not to go on them. Principals reported pressure from accountability, specifically test-based accountability and tight budgets for reasons that they chose to forgo field trips. And then teachers specifically reported a decline in arts education as well as field trips, particularly among economically disadvantaged students. And there's kind of a combination of things where administrators are feeling pressure from test-based accountability. And usually the schools where they report feeling the most pressure are schools that serve economically disadvantaged students. And these are the schools that are typically reducing the number of field trips that they take. So this is, and I should say a little bit more broadly about, I got into this research from, I had the opportunity to do a study where we were randomly assigning students to receive a field trip to go to a theater. go to a live theater. Some we just took to campus to watch a movie of it, and then some stayed at school. And as we started recruiting students and schools to participate in this, we were calling schools, and teachers and principals were like, oh, that would be an awesome opportunity. We were offering a completely free opportunity. We paid for tickets to the theater. We paid for the bus. We fed students lunch when they got there. We even paid for a sub back at school if a teacher needed a sub in the classroom. So it was completely free, a great opportunity. And we had principals and teachers saying like, oh, we would love to do that, but we just can't take time out of the classroom to do so. And so through that study, I started thinking, there's a lot more here, right? Why are teachers so hesitant to take time out of the classroom? And they say, that would be a great opportunity for my students, but I can't take time out of the classroom. So this was kind of more of my motivation to understand, well, what is the value of field trips, and is there something that we might be missing from this trade-off, or is this a beneficial trade-off that administrators and teachers are making? So for this specific study, we wanted to know, do students experience social, emotional, and academic benefits from multiple field trips to cultural institutions? We also wanted to know, do the effects persist over time? So not just a day after they went, or a week after they went, or a month, but years after they've attended these institutions, do these, if there are effects, do they persist over time? So we randomly assign 4th or 5th grade classes within a school in about 15 elementary schools to receive 3 culturally enriching field trips throughout the year. And then we measure the impact on student social, emotional, and academic outcomes. And the 3 field trips they got, so we're working with an urban school district in the Atlanta area, and they get to attend the Woodruff Arts Center. The Woodruff Arts Center is a wonderful art institution, and they have 3 different art mediums. So they have the High Museum of Art, the Alliance Theater, and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, all world-class art institutions who they have education programming specifically for 4th and 5th graders. So what do we kind of add to the research, and what do we think the benefit of this study is? So first, we are using an experimental design, which is considered the gold standard because it allows us to estimate the causal impacts of attending arts-focused field trips. And I'll talk why we think this was really important, because in the arts education and field trip world, a lot of the research is just observational at the time, and we really wanted to bring a rigorous design to it. So the second is that we offer multiple trips to different arts institutions. So there is some research looking at the impact of like just art museums or just theater, but we want to say like, what if we just take like a general arts exposure, right? Not so specific to a specific art medium, but general arts institutions. So then the third is that we are working with a large urban school district. So we're working with the school district in the Atlanta area, and it serves primarily minority and low income students, the population that we're serving. And past studies have mostly looked at kind of exposure to arts for rural students who don't have proximity access to such institutions. And then fourth is we really wanted to do a longitudinal study, and we wanted to follow these students multiple years after treatment to see if there were any lasting impacts from such an intervention. So I'll go really quickly over the previous literature. Like I said, a lot of the previous literature focuses on observational studies. One, because when you're looking at involvement in the arts, there's lots of selection issues, and it's hard to kind of get around these issues. But generally, there's a relationship between students' involvement in the arts and their academic performance, as well as students and families who say they like to attend arts institutions or have arts at home or participate in, music classes or things like that. Have kind of academic and social benefits, at least in the short term, while they're participating in these programs. So there is some research using an experimental design that looks at the effect of visiting single arts institutions. So there's been things that look at visits to art museums or to theaters. And they have found that students experience kind of social emotional benefits like tolerance, empathy. They also report a greater desire to consume the arts, as well as some academic benefits like critical thinking and content knowledge from these programs. And then there's also some new literature looking at arts integration programs and showing that students who participated in arts integration programs have greater school engagement, kind of through reduced discipline, and also have some academic benefits, especially when it comes to reading and writing. So a little bit more on our research design. So like I said, we're using an experimental design, and we took fourth and fifth grade within a school, randomly assigned fourth to receive treatment and fifth to receive control, or vice versa. And then we surveyed all of the students in the fall of their first year. And then throughout the year, they received the 3 field trips to the Woodruff Art Center, to the 3 different art institutions. And then our control group received business as usual. So let me tell you a little bit about what the control condition looks like. So the district we work with pays for 1 field trip every year for all students. So our control group is really getting 1 field trip, and it could be to a variety of institutions. It could be to one of the art institutions that our control groups go to, or our treatment groups go to. It could also be to a variety of other places. So when we asked the control group what they did, that some went to the aquarium, the Natural History Museum, some went to the College Football Hall of Fame, some toured the Falcons Stadium. So there was a whole host. Some went to the Jimmy Carter Library. So you can really view the difference that we estimate here is the difference between receiving 3 arts-based field trips to receiving 1 field trip to some institution in the Atlanta area is kind of the control group. So then after they received their field trips, we surveyed all students in the spring. And then we only did surveys in the first year, which I'll talk a little bit more about why we did that. And then we received administrative data for these students in the first year and then subsequent years following.
Heidi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Were there any issues with like parental permission or students opting out of the treatment or like, and then also I'm curious if you could talk anything about like, did you have any concerns when you were setting up this design, like whether there would be kind of like negative spillover effects on like the other grade that like didn't get to go on the 3 things, and it's like, oh, like 5th graders get to do, or actually it'd probably be more the opposite, like 4th graders get to go on these field trips that like we never got to go on when we were in 4th grade.
Yeah, so these are good questions. So one on the consent part. So it was generally we had high consent into it because it was like we sent our research material along with like, hey, here's everything that you're going for the field trip. And it was sent with like, here's your permission for the field trip and the study. So a lot of people consented to it. The one problem we did get with that is we had a lower consent rate in the control group because it wasn't like, oh, I need to sign my permission form so that the kids can go on a field trip. It was just like, hey, will you consent to be in this study? And so there was some differences. We had lower consent rate in the control group, which we were a little worried about at first, but one of the benefits of the design like this is that it's really hard for students to kind of like a trip from the study because of treatment assignment, right? It's unlikely that a 5th grader who got signed as control is like, oh, my parent's going to bump me down a grade so I can go to 3 field trips, right? Or vice versa, like, oh, I'm going to bump my kid up in a grade to get 3 field trips. So we didn't think the treatment was necessarily enticing one way or the other, but it was a lot harder to get teachers to be like, hey, get those consent forms back from your students when you don't get anything from it. And the treatment students were more proactive at being like, hey, make sure you sign those consent forms. And then what was, to your point on kind of like the spillover effects, like if a certain grade was like, hey, they get to do these, field trips and we don't. What we found from talking with teachers in the school is that the grades really, they actually don't have much communication between each other. So like the 4th grade teachers work really close together and the 5th grade teachers, but there's not like a ton of back and forth between them. And so we didn't hear much on that point.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Just really quick, Heidi, can I pose a question
John.
too? Was there any difference in terms of the kind of the parental supervision of the field trips? Because I can imagine, I wonder if you had more parents or less parents on the kind of, control group, or was it just kind of left up to the schools to figure that out?
So this is a great question. And this is one thing we have done. So we've also done focus groups with our teachers who participate in this study to help us understand a lot more about what was going on. And when we asked about parental like chaperones and stuff, they get very few parental chaperones on their field trips in the first place. And so they were kind of like, parents, we get like a couple, like they like, we kind of asked the question and they were like, yeah, a couple come, and they kind of say it's like usually the same parents who come every time, but it's mostly staffed by the school. So the fourth and whether it was, the grade teachers come, and then usually like the art, or if they had like a music teacher or something, they usually came on the field trip, and you usually got a principal or an assistant principal who came with them. So yeah, great questions. So for our student surveys, like I said, we only do this in the first year that they're in the study. And so we asked them questions like, how interested do they like to consume the arts, right? Do you want to go to these type of institutions? And also, do you want to participate in the arts, right? Do you want to make art or be in a play or play an instrument or something like that? We also asked them about their school engagement. These are really simple questions like, is school boring and stuff like that, trying to get a sense of how much they like school. Then we also ask questions on like tolerance, empathy, social perspective taking, and then we use some survey effort measures like item non-response and careless answering to kind of get at their kind of conscientiousness or effort on the survey. And then in their administrative records that we receive from the district, we get their Georgia milestones, which is the state standardized test in Georgia, along with their courses and their grades, and then their attendance and disciplinary records. So we get, we feel like a really comprehensive look, or shouldn't say comprehensive, a good holistic view of multiple student outcomes that might be affected through these field trips. So a little bit more on our design. So we rolled this study out across 3 different years. So we added a new cohort of students each time. And what this allows us to do is we are able to estimate the effect of 3 field trips in 1 year. So this is a big chart. I'll point out kind of the most important thing. So in year 1, within each of our schools, we had 4 schools, and we randomized if 4th grade was treatment, 5th grade was control. So what we can also do is estimate the effect of 6 field trips in 2 years. So for our 4th graders who were treatment, who go into 5th grade in the 2nd year, they're still in the same school. So we offer them the treatment again. So we have a subgroup of students who get 6 field trips across 2 years. And then we're able to look at the effect 1 year following treatment and 2 years following treatment. So, and in the 2nd year, we added a new cohort of students in our 4 original schools. New 4th graders come in. And then we added 6 additional schools. And then in year 3, we had our new cohorts in the previous schools, plus an additional 5 schools. So this ends up to be about 2,000 students in our sample across 4 different treatment categories. So here are baseline equivalents for us between our treatment and control group at baseline. A couple of things I want to point out, though, about our sample. So about 99% of our students identify as Black or African American. And I don't have, the only measure we have of kind of economic disadvantage is free or reduced price lunch. And all of our schools classify all of our students as FRL. So it's 100%. So we don't include that measure here, but it's to say we're working with the relatively homogeneous population as far as demographics go. So then when we look at the difference between our treatment and control groups at baseline, these first variables are everything we receive from the district. So this is the year prior to them receiving treatment. And we see no significant differences on their demographics, nor their academic performance. So their ELA, their math test, we also do a combined test that some include like a science test score, and their course grades. We see no difference between our treatment and control groups, as well as discipline measures, so the number of infractions and suspensions, as well as the days absent students are. So we really feel like we're getting a very balanced treatment and control group. So when we look at our survey measures, these are our pre-treatment, the difference on our pre-treatment survey measures, we see a couple significant differences between the students, between our treatment and control students. We're not overly concerned about this. One, we think there was some priming going on from the teachers of like encouraging their treatment students to answer in a certain way. But overall, the number of differences we're looking at, seeing these two significant ones, don't concern us greatly, that our treatment and control groups are different on unobservable characteristics that we're not accounting for. And then we do control for these differences in our models. So our identification strategy, given that we have an experimental design, we actually can use a very straightforward strategy here. So we're going to estimate the average treatment effect for our given outcomes. And so we have our 4 different treatment categories. So one treat is like their first 3 field trips in 1 year, 2 treatment is 6 field trips in 2 years, then 1 year post-treatment and 2 years post-treatment. And then we control for the baseline measure of our given outcome. And then we have student characteristics. We include a fixed effect for each school, right? Because we're really comparing treatment and control students within the same school. Then we include a student random effect, and our errors are clustered at the classroom level. So here are the outcomes from our survey measures. So like I said, in our surveys, we only have the first year of treatment, right? So these are measured a few months after they've received all of the field trips. So we see, and these are all measured in standard deviation forms. So we found a positive impact that treatment students were more likely to consume the arts by about 12% of a standard deviation, or more likely to say they wanted to consume the arts by about 12% of a standard deviation, more than their control counterparts. They were also more likely to agree with this statement. So this was like our tolerance measure, and it was agreeing with the statement of people can have different opinions about the same thing, right? Some of these bigger measures like tolerance, there's a lot of constructs for measuring tolerance, and to administer a survey to 4th and 5th graders, we really had to condense some of these larger things down. So it's just one question on do you believe people can have different opinions about the same thing? We find that treatment students are about 13% of a standard deviation more likely to agree with that statement than control students. And we see no effect on art, their desire to participate in the arts, social perspective taking, which is similar to tolerance, nor their empathy. And we see some evidence that treatment students were less careless. So a negative here would be a positive finding, right? That they were more conscientious in taking the survey when looking at careless answering. So here are the effects for our administrative outcomes. So here we have our 4 different treatment conditions here. And these are all in standard deviation forms, except the proportion absent and number of infractions. So we find no treatment impacts in the first or second year of treatment. What we end up finding is that 2 years after treatment, that students experience about a 13% standard deviation increase in their math and reading test scores, as well as about a 24% of a standard deviation increase in their course grades. So we also see following treatment that our treatment students have a reduction in the number of absences, as well as the number of infractions that they have in school. Now, we did not anticipate seeing kind of no impact in the first years of treatment and then kind of finding these medium run impacts. So I should also note that all of the years post-treatment, students are in 6th or 7th grade at this time. And this is also coincides with a shift from elementary school to middle school. So treatment ends at the same time that they switch schools. So a couple potential explanations for this. So one, it could be that the treatment helped facilitate a better change, that students were more equipped to deal with a change in school structure from their experiences on these field trips. It also could be, especially when we're looking at the proportion absent and the number of infractions, that there's also a structural difference between elementary and middle school, especially when it comes to how absent students are and disciplinary infractions. So we see in our, not a lot of kids in elementary school get written up for infractions. A lot more students in middle school get written up for infractions. And we see that in our data, that we just have a lot more variability. So it could be that we just have enough variation now to pick up a treatment effect now that students are in middle school, that there could have been a treatment effect in elementary school. We just can't pick it up due to low variation. Or it could be that, the skills students are learning and that they're just now better equipped to deal with change as they move into middle school. But it definitely was not what we had anticipated going in finding this, and is different from previous studies who really find impacts in the first year of treatment on both kind of these more social outcomes that we have in the survey, as well as some academic outcomes. So what do we find? What do we think is beneficial here? So one, we do think there is evidence that students benefit academically and socially from treatment, but we do have somewhat of a cautious interpretation. So we are confident in our design. I said, we are very confident in our baseline. I said we had a little bit of attrition differences with consent in and out of treatment groups, but we ran a lot of tests on them, and we feel like our design was robust and should give us causal estimates. We should feel confident in our estimates. But we didn't expect this pattern of middle run results, right? And really, when we started into the study, my prior was that arts and these type of experiences are beneficial on their own, right? They have a lot of kind of social and cultural benefits, but they might not benefit a math score or a reading score, right? But that doesn't mean arts and that field trips aren't beneficial. And so I expected to find no test score effects and no real academic effects. And then when we started looking at the impacts and we started seeing academic effects, and this is one thing I'll get down here later, is that the effects somewhat vary over cohorts. So like I said, when we rolled out the study over 3 years, and our first cohort had very strong test score impacts in year 1 and year 2 and year 3 across all treatment conditions. And they ranged from anywhere from about 13% of its standard deviation to over 20% of a standard deviation increase in their test scores. So this was the first data we started looking at in years 1 and 2. And I was really caught off guard. And so was our research team, of thinking, this isn't what we anticipated would be the effect. We thought there'd be no effect on student test scores, to say, look, you can take 3 days out of it, 3 days out of the classroom with no harm, but you're not going to increase math test scores by going to an art museum for a day, right? But these are the effects we were seeing for cohort 1. And then fortunately, we had planned to do multiple cohorts, and the study was designed to pool all the cohorts together. And we can also think of it as kind of a replication of the study 3 different times, right? In cohort 1, cohort 2, and cohort 3, which I think is really valuable when doing field work like this. So I think our biggest takeaway that we feel most confident in from this study is that there's no harm to students from taking time out of the classroom to kind of take time away for field trips or other kind of arts and cultural enrichment. That there's not a harm to test scores or academic performance or how they behave in school. There might actually be a big benefit to them. So the other big takeaway is that we really feel like the effects that we're capturing really are a benefit from multiple kind of cultural experiences and arts experiences, and not just like a one-time thing. So one, the treatment was multiple field trips, but also when we asked our students at baseline how often or had they attended the Woodruff Art Center before, or had you been to an art museum or a theater or something before? Over 70% of our students said they had attended the Woodruff Art Center before, usually with their school in earlier grades. And so lots of our students have already participated in at least one of these art institutions. And we find from continual experience with these arts institutions, we still see benefit from them. So we do think that there's some evidence to say that benefits from arts exposure isn't just like a one and done type of a thing, but that continual exposure can be beneficial for students. So, as always, there are some important limitations. So when I said effects do vary by cohort, right? We feel most comfortable pooling all of the cohorts together. Each cohort, has slightly different things, and generally the student population is very similar to each other, and it was designed to pool them together. But effects do vary with, like I said, cohort 1 having very strong test score impacts across all treatment categories, and cohort 2 not having any, and then cohort 3 also having some, right? But it's also to say that some of the impacts we see could be driven by our cohort 1 students, or some different experience that we don't fully understand right now. And then the second is, like I said, we do have a unique student population, right? So it could be that these experiences would affect a heterogeneous population in different ways, or a rural or more suburban population in a different way than it is affecting our relatively racially and economically homogeneous group in an urban setting. So the other limitation is that we found surveys actually to be a really weak instrument for measuring things like tolerance and empathy for this population of students. So we worked with teachers at the district, as well as the education team at the Woodruff Art Center, to construct our surveys in a way that was on grade level, that would be accessible to the students. And we also read all of the surveys out loud and helped students answer them as they needed. But as we were reading them out loud and helping students answer, it was very apparent to us that a lot of students struggled answering the questions. So this is another thing at baseline, because we have their baseline test scores from the prior year, and about 78% of our students perform below proficiency on their Georgia Milestone reading exams, and 48% of them are classified as beginner learners, which is the lowest achievement category in Georgia. So it became exceptionally difficult to have 4th and 5th graders understand the survey, understand their answers, and then respond on like a Likert scaled question to, strongly agree to strongly disagree on somewhat abstract questions like tolerance or empathy. And so that's why we ended up only doing them surveys in the first year, because we really felt like we weren't getting great information from the survey. So fortunately, we had the administrative data, which we end up relying on quite heavily for these students. And another limitation, while experimental designs are great at estimating causal impacts, they're a black box, right? They don't tell us why these experiences impacted students in the way they did, right? And so to try and unpack this a bit, we have done some focus groups with teachers that we're currently working on to help understand what their experiences were with the field trips. We've also done some interviews with students to say, what did you like the most about these experiences? And we've gotten some really great insight from them in a variety of ways. One of my favorite things about asking the students about what they liked about these field trips is the facilities are gorgeous. They are world class. And the High Museum of Art has this glass elevator that goes up all of the flights. And you can look out to the city on one side, and then you can see each layer of each floor of the museum and pass these, really cool works of art. Every student was like, the elevator was my favorite thing. That was the best thing we've ever done. Like I could just ride up and down it. And then when we interviewed the students who had been a couple times, The students on their second time to the art museum talked less about the elevator and told us more about the works of art that they liked or different experiences. So it was kind of this idea of this multiple exposures to it and experiences with it also deepened their experience each time they went with it. You know, we had one student who walked into the symphony, and the symphony hall, the entrance is like all marble, big circular marble staircases, you know, a really kind of grand entrance. And he asked his teacher, he's like, can we eat lunch in here? He's like, I just want to sit in this room, right? And like soak in what is going on and happening in the room. So there's a lot that goes on that our design doesn't capture. And so doing these kind of focus groups and interviews has been really helpful to start to understand some of the mechanisms that might be at work here that lead to these outcomes that we see. So then policy implications. So I think our biggest takeaway, like I've said, is that the results really question the practice of reducing field trips for increased class time, right? Or increased test prep. That we think there's clear evidence to say you can take students out of the classroom, even for schools who feel like they're facing really strong accountability pressures, which all of these schools report that they do, that you can take 3 days out of the year and kind of offer a broader curriculum without harming student test scores or students' performance in school, and you might actually improve it. And then the other big takeaway is that school field trips can help provide kind of equitable access to cultural institutions, right? So these institutions are sometimes difficult to get into for economic barriers. And lots of our students, when we asked who you had been to these institutions with prior, your friends, your family, or your school, almost 100% of them say they went with their school. And so there's also a question that reducing field trips, especially in schools that serve a high proportion of low-income students, that schools can also help facilitate equitable access to these arts institutions. So that is a quick overview of the study. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you have any thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Erickson. So we have a solid 10-20 minutes for questions from the audience. And I know, Heidi, there were a few questions or comments in the chat.
Yeah, I will read these here quick.
Hey, my name is Alex Wiseman. I don't know if you can hear me. My internet's been acting up, which is why I put my questions in the chat. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. I had some questions that I did put in the chat that you probably answered and I just missed it.
No.
But I am interested if there were any, if you noticed or measured any changes in teacher behavior or activity around this, especially for those teachers that might have been, part of the field trips or anything else. And then my other question was, if you had a diverse set of field trips, maybe going to places that are, not necessarily cultural institutions, but could have another kind of, benefit to the students, would you expect similar results?
Yeah, so I think these are two really good questions. So first, to your teacher one, this is not something we didn't collect anything. That's the most simple answer. However, this came up as soon as we were looking at our first year results. We were trying to understand, like, we're seeing really big student achievement differences in their test score. Like, what is going on? And then we were like, maybe we're treating the teachers and not just the students, right? And so we've talked to teachers about some of this to try and better understand. And so right now I have a lot of hypotheses and not a lot of answers for it. So one, I'll say I have two explanations that I think are most compelling to me right now. One is that as we've talked to teachers and students, they talk about the experiences and that they really like grew together in these different things, right? Talking about like sitting in the symphony hall, and then they would come back to class and just talk about what that meant, how they felt, and different things. And they talked about, some teachers said, you know, like, we saw a lot of students who fell asleep in the symphony, right? It's dark, beautiful music is playing. They fell asleep. And, you know, some teachers kind of, we went on the field trips and observed the field trips, and we asked about it. And they were like, you know, some people might say that's disengaged. They're like, from the background that our students have, one teacher was like, I'm so grateful that we gave our students a peaceful place to be for a little bit. And if they took a nap, it might have been the best thing that they could have done. And so kind of create, like, it was a thought of us like, okay, this is creating much more of an experience, and it might not be about the content, but a relationship between the teacher and the student that's built that then translates to the classroom, right? They feel more cohesive and unified, and the students feel like, hey, I want to try better in school, right? So that's our other kind of point, is that maybe it's like an effort thing, that like maybe school's a little bit more exciting right now, right? Like, we did these cool things and I come back energized and like, oh, school's awesome because like I saw this great connection at the art museum to what we're doing here. And that translated into more effort in the classroom and more excitement that translated into test scores. So those are the two hypotheses that I would love to dig into more, which we hope to kind of get a little bit a better of idea with our interviews with teachers, but also we've talked about like, how could we design a study to understand how we're treating teachers, right? And this study wasn't great because we also had teachers who then flipped, because most teachers stay in the grade. And so how we had the study organized is we had, like, if they were fourth grade was treatment, their students move on to fifth grade. So now the fifth grade teachers have treatment, but the fourth grade teachers stay and have new fourth graders come in who are control students, but we've treated the teacher. So we've also had conversations like, does that diminish our, or like wash out our treatment control difference if we're treating this teacher as well? So our study was designed poorly to get at this. And then your other question was on kind of, does the content of the field trip matter? And this is a question we've wrestled with a lot, because obviously in a study like this, and it's one of the benefits and drawbacks from an experimental design, right, is that it really comes down to like, what is the difference between the treatment and business as usual, right? And the content of the field trip might matter. But what we also wanted to do to get away from a little bit of the content is the prior studies we've done was like just one visit to an art museum, one visit to a theater, right? And we want to say, we don't necessarily care as much about the content, because from a policy perspective, I also sometimes I'm hesitant to say like, hey, there are great benefits from field trips, because I never want a district to think the policy implication is we should do 3 arts-based field trips in a year. I think the broader policy implication is to say, hey, think about trade-offs you're making between class time and like seat time and prepping for a test and broader experiences you could offer for your kids. And I think that's the bigger policy takeaway, because it's the specific content is hard to say, like, you should do X. I think the arts are great, and there's a whole reason why I think arts are valuable. But going to a zoo, a science museum, going to the Martin Luther King Center in Georgia, right? All of these things could be really valuable experiences that I have wrestled with in this to say, like, my prior would be that the teachers and the principals know their students better and know the type of experiences that would be beneficial for them. And from a policy side, I want to say, okay, what does it do when you trade classroom time for these experiences? But also knowing the content hopefully matters. So it's one area that I want to continue working in. And one thing that I think is really interesting, especially now, is this idea, lots of schools have been taking virtual field trips. And art museums are especially putting together things where they have like videos, right? Where they like walk through and they do their whole presentation, but students watch it as a video. Or symphonies do it, or they bring art into the classroom and show them stuff as like a field trip. And I think it's really fascinating to know if if an experience like that is as effective as attending the actual institution, which my prior is that it's maybe not, especially given the accounts that students and teachers gave us were mostly about the facilities and like the experience of leaving school and being in these cool places. So it's a question of like, does art get watered down when I bring it in an easel in a classroom versus seeing it on the wall for the space it was made for? So I think there's still a lot of questions around that. So that was a very long answer to your questions.
Yeah, Heidi, a very good quick follow-up on that. I mean, to me, I look at a lot of what you presented and I see it as, and this is just, again, my prior, so to speak, right? Like,
Yeah.
To me, like a big mechanism is just, I'm changing up the school day. Like I'm changing up like in a very simple way, like, you're giving something kids look forward to, at multiple points of the year. And so I'm just curious if like, is the literature clear on that? Like, if you were to design a whole, like, I'm IES, I give you $1 million to do a bigger RCT, like, would you go down the path of like, I'm going to look at like I'm going to focus on the content of these experiences, or would you go down the path of looking more about like kind of structural shifts to the school day? Like, where would you kind of place your priority?
Yeah. So Jacob, I think this is a really great question. So 2 points. So the answer is we don't have a lot of evidence from the research of what this is. So 2 things that we do. So a prior study that I did on the theater, like I said, we took students to the theater and then we wanted to get at this, like, is it just that you got out of school for a day, right? And it's like a break from the classroom. And so what we did is we took students to campus and showed them a movie of the play, right? So they got out of their classroom, they came up to campus, we still fed them lunch, we did like a little campus tour, and then we went in a big auditorium and showed them a movie of the play. It was Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. And so then other students still came up to campus, but they went on a bus to the theater and the other students stayed at campus. And then we had a control group who stayed at school, who received nothing. And we found that the students who saw the movie outcome were much more similar to those at school than to those who went to the theater. Specifically in content knowledge, when we asked them about like the plot of the play, there was no significant effect. They were like almost like the control students as understanding the plot. And like we asked them vocabulary and stuff. And same with, we asked like tolerance and social perspective taking questions. Those who went to the actual theater were much higher. Now that is one piece of evidence in like a very specific, RCT. The other one, there was one that did an art museum, took kids to an art museum, took art to school. So they didn't leave school in this one, but they took art to school and did a presentation at school. And they didn't find as strong effects for when they brought art to school, but that doesn't get at that kind of shift. But those are the only 2 points of evidence that I'm aware of on this point. So my priority, if I was to design my own study or an additional study after this, it would focus probably both a little bit on content, but a lot on structural changes. So like, I would love to do something like this where someone receives like a more virtual type of field trip, a field trip to the museum, and then total business as usual. But neither of these to try and understand that, because I think that's very policy relevant for teachers who are trying to make these decisions, and administrators of like, well, it's more cost effective to have someone come into school, right? Or like it's more cost effective to watch a video of the play, right? You read a Shakespeare play, you can, a common thing for teachers is to turn a movie on after you read it, right? To like watch the play. But that might not be as effective as going to the play, right? So yeah, really, really good questions.
Hey, Heidi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you captured any information about equity, like giving kids experiences they would never get if you didn't have these opportunities in school.
Yeah, so this is a good question. So we asked about, on the survey, we asked, like, have you been to these type of institutions with your family before, with your friends? And lots of times we'd say like, it was like a multiple choice, like, have you been with your family, friends, or school? And they would mark family. And then we'd ask them to write who they were, who they went with. And they were always like, who was our teacher last year? Who was on that trip with us? And so as we talked to them, it was really like, they're getting these from their school, right? So we have that information, which is somewhat messy, given that it's the students' responses, you know, reflecting back. And then we asked our teachers also in our focus groups. This is one of our big focuses, to say like, what is your students' like prior exposure to these institutions, right? And it's also not to say that like these neighborhoods also have a lot of culture in them. So I'm not saying that it's like a cultural deficit, but it is like the Woodruff Arts Center is not far from these students' houses, right? But most of them don't attend without their school, right? Or a lot of people also went to our control students went to, some of them went to the Martin Luther King Center, which is downtown Atlanta as well. And they can like walk to it from their school. And it was one of the first times the students had ever been, you know, so one of our control teachers, we were talking to him, she's like, we walked on the field trip. We didn't even get a bus. Like we just walked down there. And she was like, my students in 5th grade had never been to the King Museum, right? And so there is a lot, at least, so that's the evidence we have. It's not systematic or very comprehensive, but what we do know, or from what we know, it does seem like schools are really their access point to these types of institutions. And that without the school, a lot of them would not attend these places.
Other questions? So Jordan, your comment in the chat is very good. Thinking about partnerships with local museums and districts, and how do we kind of move this forward if this were to scale, and think about implications there.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I should have at the first given a lot of credit to the Woodruff Art Center for doing this, because the Woodruff Art Center has been a phenomenal partner, and they actually reached out to us they knew some of our prior work on art museums and theater, and said, hey, we have education programming. It's one of like our key missions. We would love to understand what we're doing and how to do better. And so they were a phenomenal partner. They were open to doing an experimental design. And really the reason we were able to do it is they had such a good relationship with school districts around them, that school districts were more than welcoming for us to come in. They were so accommodating to understanding and taking time to do field trips too. So it was a great benefit, and I found that working with specific organizations that have the relationships with the districts has been an incredible benefit. And without that relationship, the school districts don't trust like a researcher at a university as much as they do their partner, and then say, hey, we have this great opportunity. And then we're able to go into the schools and talk and, you know, make them feel really comfortable with us, to the point that, you know, I can call one of the teachers and be like, hey, I'm in Atlanta. Can I come and talk to you about something? And they're like, yeah, come on down, come, you know, meet with our students in a way that's really, really helpful. And it's a natural relationship for the arts institution, because they're providing field trips and programming for the schools. So there was also a lot of feedback on from the schools of like information they receive from the institution of like before, like lots of schools were like, hey, give us more, you know, like prep beforehand, right? We can kind of, you know, work with our students before and introduce them to the content that they'll see at the symphony or something like that. And then if the art museum can provide, you know, a small curriculum or a small packet after you get back to like talk about your experience and connect it to the curriculum that you're doing is really helpful.
think we have time for one more question if someone has one. I have no problem being selfish and taking the last question myself. So Heidi, one last quick question. I'm just curious about costs, right? So like, I think one of the, not only many of the things you're talking about moving this forward is trying to understand some of the mechanism piece to it, but I'm also curious, it doesn't sound like that expensive of an intervention, but I am curious if you were to like have a conversation with a district wanting to do something similar to what you did, like what is kind of how much did it cost? And of course, taking researcher piece to it, like just like to implement the program. And then like, what was the actual cost? What would the cost be to a school if you have something like a partnership with the museum?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So this is another part that's really worked out well for this is the Woodruff Art Center had a funder who came to them and said, I would love to have more students experience the arts, and gave them a large endowment to increase their educational offerings. So the Woodruff Art Center was able to offer these field trips free to the district, which helped substantially. And part of the funding was, hey, we want an evaluation of this. And, given the evaluation, then we want to expand it. So now they have funding to do this for all 4th and 5th graders. So now currently all 4th and 5th graders receive the 3 field trips throughout the year. So it worked great in that case. Cost can sometimes be prohibitive, even though it really is a low cost intervention. Like compared to all other things we see in education, this is very low cost and low touch and relatively easy to do. So the biggest hurdles schools say are buses. So, and usually it ends up it's the cost of a bus, but it's usually shortage of drivers is what they have the hardest kind of say is their biggest hurdle to it. So it is, but it's also like when principals are on board and administrators are on board, the funding happens. And because it really is not that big compared to other things that they're doing in the school, but it's been our experience that it really is buy-in. Like if the administrator is on board, then it's like, great, we'll do it. And it's like, it seems to be easy. So some schools, we had principals who were more on board with it. And like when we talk to our teachers, they're like, any field trip I bring up to my principal, if it's like a good opportunity, they're like, great, we'll make it work. Like I'll get a bus for you. We'll figure it out. And other people are like, I'm always convincing my principal, like, this is valuable for our students. This is valuable for our students. And they can never seem to get them on board. And then the money doesn't come. So it's because a lot of institutions will offer educational programming at a huge discount to come to the museum if they don't offer it for free. So there is another study that does a survey of this, of like what museums offer field trips for free, how much do they cost, just like a survey of what's available. And most have very discounted, if not free opportunities. I think it really comes down to administrators who buy into the idea that this is valuable for their students.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Erickson. It's been lovely having you kick off the series for us. Thanks again for sharing your time. For everyone else, Dr. Erickson's talk is going to be posted on our YouTube channel and our website so that you can come back to it, or maybe you're watching it now on a recording. And don't forget, we have our second talk coming up in a month on November 15th. And yeah, that's it. Thanks again, Heidi. It was good to meet you.
Thank you all. It was
really
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.